It was the first weekend of fall when Jessica and her friends decided to take a trip to the small cabin in the woods her family owned. Nestled deep in the Appalachian mountains, the cabin was isolated. No neighbors for miles, no cell service, and the kind of place where one could get away from the world. It was perfect for a weekend retreat. They'd planned for a weekend of hiking, drinking hot chocolate by the fire, and telling ghost stories. What they didn't expect was to encounter something far worse than any of the tales they'd told each other. They arrived just before dusk. The air was crisp and cool, and the woods were alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered wood and surrounded by tall, towering trees. There were no streetlights here, only the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through the branches. It felt remote, untouched, like the rest of the world didn't exist. As they unpacked and settled in, Jessica's friend Rachel pointed out a trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the forest. "We should check it out tomorrow morning," Rachel suggested. Before we get too comfortable." The others agreed, and they spent the evening inside, playing cards and enjoying the quiet, isolated surroundings. The sounds of the forest seemed to surround them, but the fire crackling in the fireplace kept them warm and safe. But as the night grew later, an uneasy feeling settled over Jessica. She couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching them. The others were too caught up in their laughter to notice, but Jessica couldn't help but glance at the darkened windows. The trees outside were still, too still. The wind had died down completely, leaving only silence. It was when the clock struck midnight that they all heard it. A soft, distant whistling. At first, Jessica thought it was just the wind, but the longer it went on, the more deliberate it became. It was a low, eerie tune, a melody that seemed oddly familiar, yet unsettling. It came from somewhere in the woods. "Do you hear that?" Jessica asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her friends fell silent, listening. The whistling continued, growing louder. "It's probably just a hunter or someone from the nearby town," Rachel suggested, though her voice trembled slightly. But Jessica wasn't so sure. There was something about the whistling that felt wrong. It didn't sound like a bird or the wind. It sounded deliberate, like someone was trying to get their attention. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. The group sat in uncomfortable silence, their eyes flicking toward the windows as if expecting to see someone standing there. But nothing. The night resumed its usual eerie stillness. The next morning, they decided to go hiking. They packed some snacks and water bottles and headed toward the trail behind the cabin. It was a short walk, but the dense trees and thick underbrush made it feel much longer. As they ventured deeper into the woods, Jessica kept looking over her shoulder. The uneasy feeling from the night before still lingered. The trail eventually led them to an old, abandoned shack. It was covered in vines and the windows were shattered, allowing the wind to whistle through the broken panes. A cold shiver ran down Jessica's spine as she stepped closer. "This place is creepy," she muttered. Her friends, though intrigued, agreed. The shack didn't look like it had been used in decades. There was no sign of life, only rotting wood and the faintest smell of decay. Rachel peered inside through one of the shattered windows. "Hey guys, there's something in there," she said, her voice barely audible. They gathered around as Rachel pointed through the glass. Inside, there was a single rocking chair, gently rocking back and forth, as if someone had just left it. But there was no one in sight. The group fell silent. Something about the chair's slow, deliberate movement was chilling. It was as if whatever had been sitting there was still lingering, watching them from the shadows. "Let's get out of here," Jessica suggested. Her nerves were on edge, and she didn't want to stay in the shack any longer than necessary. But just as they turned to leave, they all heard it again, the whistling. It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but it grew louder and louder, the same eerie tune they had heard the night before. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway, but the whistling remained constant. "Where is it coming from?" Rachel asked, looking around. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. There was no one else around. The whistling stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was oppressive, as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath. Jessica felt a cold hand press against the back of her neck. She turned quickly, but no one was there. "Let's just go. Back to the cabin," Jessica said, her voice tight with fear. But as they began to walk away, they heard the whistling again. Closer this time. Almost directly behind them. Jessica froze. The sound was no longer coming from the trees, it was coming from the shack. They turned back, and there, standing in the doorway of the shack, was a figure. A tall man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His long, thin fingers were lifted to his lips, whistling that haunting tune. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. The man's posture was unnatural, his body too still, his movements too precise. And then, as if sensing their gaze, he tilted his head ever so slightly, his eyes never meeting theirs. In a flash, the man disappeared into the shadows of the shack, leaving only the faintest echo of his whistling behind. "Run!" Jessica screamed. The group bolted down the trail, not daring to look back. Their feet pounded against the ground as they made their way back to the cabin, heartbeats racing, adrenaline pumping. When they finally reached the safety of the cabin, they slammed the door shut behind them, breathless and terrified. That night they locked all the windows and doors, but as the darkness settled in, they heard it again. The whistling. It was faint at first, then louder, closer, as if the man was standing just outside the cabin, waiting. They never spoke of it again, but none of them could shake the feeling that just outside, in the thick woods, the whistler was still waiting.